Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 31st of January. I'm Andrew Wilson and this is Scotland at 7. This evening we will have a different format to the programme. To reflect properly on the political theatre which has been playing out at Westminster this afternoon, we will do things a little differently. We'll have a very brief coronavirus update, and then we can watch the contributions to the Prime Minister's statement in the House of Commons this afternoon and the questions which followed that statement. And then I will introduce this evening's guest, who is in meetings at Westminster at this precise moment, and then together we will discuss the events which we've been watching this afternoon. As of 2 p.m. today, there are 5,887 new cases identified using either a first lateral flow test or a PCR positive test. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,206 were in hospital last night, 33 of whom were in intensive care. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and that means that the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 10,311. This number includes only those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. The latest UK daily figures were not available today when we came on air. As of 7:30 a.m. this morning, 4,411,649 people in Scotland had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, 4,127,051 had received their second dose, and 3,295,501 had received a third dose or their booster. Now, this will be the last COVID update that we will give during the week. We will continue to provide a brief update on the COVID numbers during the full Scottish every Sunday lunchtime from noon. So at about 3:30 this afternoon, the Prime Minister made a statement to the House of Commons. His statement was following the release by the Cabinet Office of an update from Sue Gray regarding her investigation into alleged gatherings on government premises during COVID restrictions. Remember that the primary purpose of her investigation was to establish a general understanding of the nature of the gatherings, including attendance, the setting and the purpose, with reference to adherence to the guidance, the COVID guidance, in place at the time. Sue Gray is making this investigation because on the 17th of December last year, the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case had to recuse himself from the investigation as a result of allegations concerning an online quiz held in his private office in the Cabinet Office on Whitehall on the 17th of December 2020. So who is Sue Gray? In May 21, she took up the role of second permanent secretary to the Cabinet Office, interestingly with responsibility for the Union and Constitution Directorate. She first joined the Cabinet Office in the late 1990s and served then as the Director General for Propriety and Ethics between 2012 and 2018. This all means that she's a pretty senior civil servant, has been near the centre of power for many years, and has experience of investigating propriety and ethics in Whitehall. And remember, the document published today is an update, not a report. There won't be a report completed by Sue Gray until after the Metropolitan Police have finally completed their investigations. So, first of all, this is what the Prime Minister said in his statement in the House of Commons this afternoon.
The statement, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to make a statement. And first, I want to express my deepest gratitude to Sue Gray and all the people who have contributed to this report, which I have placed in the library of this House and which the government has published in full today for everyone to read. I will address its findings in this statement, but firstly I want to say sorry. And I'm sorry for the things we simply didn't get right, and also sorry for the way that this matter has been handled. And it's no use saying that this or that was within the rules, and it's no use saying that people were working hard. This pandemic was hard for everyone. We asked people across this country to make the most extraordinary sacrifices, not to meet loved ones, not to visit relatives before they died. And I understand the anger that people feel. But, Mr. Speaker, it isn't enough to say sorry. This is a moment when we must look at ourselves in the mirror and we must learn. And while the Metropolitan Police must yet complete their investigation, and that means there are no details of specific events in Sue Gray's report, I, of course, accept Sue Gray's general findings in full. And above all, her recommendation that we must learn from these events and act now. With respect to the events under police investigation, she says, and I quote, "No conclusions should be drawn or inferences made from this other than it is now for the police to consider the relevant material in relation to those incidents." But more broadly, she finds that there is significant learning to be drawn from these events, which must be addressed immediately across government. This does not need to wait for the police investigations to be concluded. That is why we are making changes now to the way Downing Street and the Cabinet Office run, so that we can get on with the job that I was elected to do, Mr. Speaker, and the job that this government was elected to do. First, it is time to sort out what Sue Gray rightly calls the fragmented and complicated leadership structures of Downing Street, which she says have not evolved sufficiently to meet the demands of the expansion of Number 10. And we will do that, including by creating an Office of the Prime Minister with a permanent secretary to lead Number 10. Second, Mr. Speaker, it is clear from Sue Gray's report that it is time not just to review the Civil Service and Special Advisor codes of conduct wherever necessary to ensure that they take account of Sue Gray's recommendations, but also to make sure that those codes are properly enforced. And third, I will be saying more in the coming days about the steps we will take to improve the Number 10 operation and the work of the Cabinet Office, to strengthen Cabinet government, and to improve the vital connection between Number 10 and Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I get it and I will fix it. And I want to say to the people of this country, I know what the issue is. Yes, Mr. Speaker, yes. It's whether this government can be trusted to deliver. And I say, Mr. Speaker, yes, we can be trusted. Yes, we can be trusted to deliver. We said that we would get Brexit done, Mr. Speaker, and we did. And we're setting up free ports around the whole United Kingdom. I've been to one of them today, which is creating tens of thousands of new jobs, Mr. Speaker. We said we would get this country through COVID, and we did. We delivered the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe and the fastest booster programme of any major economy, so that we've been able to restore people's freedoms faster than any comparable economy. And at the same time, we've been cutting crime by 14%, building 40 new hospitals and rolling out gigabit broadband, Mr. Speaker, and delivering all the promises of our 2019 agenda, so that we have the fastest economic growth of the G7. We have shown that we have done things that people thought were impossible, Mr. Speaker, and that we can deliver for the British people. Mr. Speaker, I remind the benches opposite. The reason we're coming out of COVID so fast is at least partly because we doubled the speed of the booster rollout. And I can tell the House and this country that we are going to bring the same energy and commitment to getting on with the job, to delivering for the British people, and to our mission to unite and level up across this country, Mr. Speaker, and I commend this statement to the House.
So the Prime Minister's statement was followed by a couple of hours of questions from MPs. Firstly, let's see what the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson's immediate predecessor, Theresa May, who's the MP for Maidenhead, had to ask.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID regulations impose significant restrictions on the freedoms of members of the public. They had a right to expect their Prime Minister to have read the rules, to understand the meaning of the rules, and indeed those around him to have done so too, and to set an example in following those rules. What the Gray report does show is that number 10 Downing Street was not observing the regulations they had imposed on members of the public. So either my right honourable friend had not read the rules, or didn't understand what they meant, and others around him, or they didn't think the rules applied to number 10. Which was it?
So little love lost there between those two senior Tories. Now, next, let's look at what Ian Blackford MP, the leader of the SNP at Westminster and the MP for Ross Skye and Lochaber, had to ask the Prime Minister.
The inquiry.
I now come to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say it's a pleasure to follow the former Prime Minister, and perhaps her behaviour in office, like many that went before her, was about dignity, about the importance of the office, of respect, of truthfulness, and the Prime Minister will be well advised to focus on those that have not dishonoured the office like he has done. Mr. Speaker, we stand here today faced with the systematic decimation of public trust in government and the institutions of the state, and at its heart, a Prime Minister being investigated by the police. So here we have it, the long-awaited Sue Gray report. What a farce. It was carefully engineered to be a fact-finding exercise with no conclusions. Now we find it's a fact-finding exercise with no facts. So let's talk facts. The Prime Minister has told the House that all guidance was completely followed. There was no party. COVID rules were followed, and that I believed it was a work event. Nobody believed him then, and nobody believes you now, Prime Minister. That is the crux. No ifs, no buts. He has willfully misled Parliament. It's bad enough.
Order! Inadvertent misled the House would be acceptable. Misled the House is not acceptable. Withdraw inadvertent.
The Prime Minister inadvertently told the House on the 8th of December that no parties had taken place, and then had to admit that they had. It's bad enough, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister's personal integrity is in the ditch, but this murky business is tainting everything around it. It is our intention to submit a motion instructing the Prime Minister to publish the Gray report in full. Will the Prime Minister obey an instruction by this House to publish as required? Mr. Speaker, amidst allegations of blackmail by Tory whips, the members opposite have been defending the indefensible. Wait for the report, we were told. Well, here it is, and it tells us very little, except it does state that there were failures of leadership and judgment by different parts of number 10. It states that some events should not have been allowed to take place. That is the Prime Minister's responsibility. If there is any honour in public life, then he would resign. Where is this? And he laughs. And the Prime Minister laughs. We ought to remind ourselves in this House that 150,000 plus of our citizens have lost their lives. Family members that couldn't be with them. And that is the sight that people will remember. A Prime Minister laughing at our public. I extend the hand of friendship to all those that have sacrificed. I certainly do not extend the hand of friendship to the Prime Minister, who is no friend of mine. Where is the shame? Where is the dignity? Meanwhile, the police investigation will drag on and on. Every moment the Prime Minister stays, trust in government and the rule of law is ebbing away. The litany of rule-breaking, the culture of contempt, the utter disdain for the anguish felt by the public who have sacrificed so much. What the public see is a man who has debased the office of Prime Minister, shrinked responsibility, dogged accountability and blamed his staff at every turn, presided over sleaze and corruption and tainted the very institutions of the state. In short, Mr. Speaker, this is a man Well, they can laugh. They can laugh. But the public know. The public know this is a man they can no longer trust. He has been investigated by the police. He misled the House. He must now resign.
Order. You'll have to withdraw that last comment.
Mr. Speaker, I gave the evidence of the 8th of December.
Order. You're going to have to withdraw misled.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has misled the House.
Unless you withdraw, I will have to stop, and that's not good. Just withdraw the words.
I am standing up for my constituents that know that this Prime Minister has lied and misled the House.
Give me the paper. Give me the paper. Inadvertently misled. I'll give you one more chance. As leader of the SNP, I don't want to have to throw you out. I'm going to give you this chance. Please.
Please to power. That man has misled the House.
Shut up. I'm sorry it's come to this, and I'm sorry that the leader of the party has not got the decency to just withdraw those words in order that this debate can be represented by all political leaders. Would you like to inadvertently?
Speaker, if the Prime Minister has inadvertently misled the House, then I will state that.
Right, we're going to leave it at that. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for withdrawing what he just said, because he was wrong then, and he, I'm afraid, is wrong in his analysis. And I apologise, as I've said, for all the suffering that people have had throughout this pandemic, and for the anger that people feel about what has taken place in number 10 Downing Street. But I've got to tell the Right Honourable Gentleman that for much of what he said, his best course is simply to wait for the inquiry to be completed.
Can I just say, I take it the Honourable Member has withdrawn it, the Right Honourable Member.
That the Prime Minister may have inadvertently misled the House.
But, order. To help me, to help the House, you withdrawn your earlier comment and replaced it with inadvertently.
It's not my fault if the Prime Minister can't be trusted to tell the truth.
Under the power given to me by Standing Order number 43, I order the Honourable Member to withdraw immediately from the House. From the House. It's all right, we don't need to bother. Right, let us move on. Andrew Mitchell.
I thought that Ian Blackford's body language was turning his back on the Speaker there, but also his righteous indignation as the Prime Minister sat laughing and smirking. Finally, we have two further MPs. Firstly, the Prime Minister's former ally, Andrew Mitchell, the MP for Sutton Coldfield, who you might remember is no fan of the Metropolitan Police either, after he had to resign after an altercation with the guards at the front of Downing Street, and he called them plebs back in 2012, when he was a government whip. And then we have Martyn Fellows, who's the SNP MP for Motherwell and Wishaw.
Right, let us move on. Andrew Mitchell.
Does my right honourable friend recall that ever since he joined the party's candidates list 30 years ago, until we got him into number 10, he has enjoyed my full-throated support? But I am deeply concerned by these events, and very concerned indeed by some of the things he has said from that dispatch box and has said to the British public and our constituents. When he kindly invited me to see him 10 days ago, I told him that I thought he should think very carefully about what was now in the best interests of our country and of the Conservative Party. And I have to tell him he no longer enjoys my support.
On with the work that I think everybody wants us to do.
Martyn Fellows.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I have enjoyed the exercise this afternoon. I've also wanted to enjoy the Prime Minister's answers to questions, but unfortunately he's duck-dived, he's done everything but answer questions about a party on the 13th of November, about whether he'll put out the final report. OK, I'll ask him one more, asked already. If you get a fine, a fixed penalty fine from the Metropolitan Police after all this is over, will you pay it yourself or ask a Tory donor to pay it for you?
I thought that it was telling to see Theresa May and Andrew Mitchell lining up against the Prime Minister, and I also think that we can see some themes emerging. Firstly, that the Prime Minister depends on donors to bail him out, and of course many of those donors are Russians with links to Vladimir Putin, who has parked his tanks on the Russian border with Ukraine. Also perhaps that Boris Johnson is now a lame duck Prime Minister. Marion Fellows talked about him ducking and diving, and shortly afterwards the SNP whip, Owen Thompson, who's the MP for Midlothian, observed that the Prime Minister is now all hobble hobble, quack quack. So that's a quick look at some of the key moments from this afternoon. So now I'd like to introduce our guest for this evening. Martyn Day has been the MP for Linlithgow and Falkirk East since the 2015 general election, when he defeated the sitting Labour MP, Michael Connaughty. Martyn, good evening. Thank you for joining us on Scotland at 7. How are you keeping this evening?
Yeah, not bad. I've had my exercise. I've literally legged it from the chamber, from the health statement back to my office to make the call. That's probably the fittest, healthiest thing I've done this week. It might be the only fit, healthy thing I do this week, but
well, if we're helping to get your blood pressure up in a good way, then that's not a bad thing, probably. Thank you for taking the time to rush from the house and to join us on Scotland at 7 this evening. We've looked at the statement made by the Prime Minister, and then a number of the questions that were asked after his statement. And so, firstly, I was struck that the Prime Minister's statement, which we've watched, was actually pretty brief. It was about 5 minutes 20 seconds. I wonder why that is. Do you think it's because he's being heavily lawyered and being told not to say very much, or is it maybe because he's got nothing to say and nowhere to run?
well, I don't. I think any time he's opened his mouth on this whole issue, he's not made his job any easier. You know, there were no rules broken. It wasn't at parties. It was a work event. You know, none of it stacks up as being even remotely credible. And it was pretty hard to come up with a lighter statement than the actual Gray report itself. We had 12 pages, 3 of which were blank, which didn't really get into many facts. So he managed to produce even fewer facts in his statement. But I'll give you a laugh. I arrived a few minutes late, so I missed his first joke. He says, regarding the statement, which I have placed in the library of this House and the government has published in full. Well, you know, it's an abridged statement. It's not a full statement at all. So yeah, comedy gold. We've never been in this position before. We have a Prime Minister being investigated for criminality. The only other one interviewed with the police has been Tony Blair. In this case, it's entirely down to his own actions. It's 16 events, 4 of which Gray's report has referenced as not being under criminal investigation, and that includes an event in his own flat, which must make this the first time in his life where he's actually got into bother for being at home with his wife. His position is completely untenable. He's a laughingstock and a complete joke. But we always knew that, and nothing much has changed there. So it's a question of, will the Tories, find the balls to actually replace him?
Absolutely, and I suppose without being glib, you're saying it at home with his wife, probably at home with his current wife, is probably a more accurate statement. But
well, yes,
certainly, I was struck by Ian Blackford this afternoon saying that this process has now turned into a farce. We have a fact find with no conclusions and a fact find with now with no facts, because the update from Sue Gray has been so reduced and boiled down, and obviously also heavily lawyered. Any statement this afternoon, the Prime Minister probably predictably made much about reorganising his Downing Street operation, setting up an office of the Prime Minister and appointing a new Principal Secretary. 2 things maybe struck me from that. Firstly, does that signal that the current Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, might be the next sacrificial lamb to follow after Allegra Stratton?
Well, I think given the Prime Minister's form here, absolutely every individual in the country would be a sacrificial lamb if that was what it took to save his skin. So yeah, I suspect the atmosphere in number 10 must be pretty tense given his track record of throwing anybody and everybody under the bus to look after his own interests. I mean, yeah, he says he knows what's wrong and he'll fix it. Well, what's wrong is him. He's the one at the top. He's the one that's created the culture. Suitcases full of booze. That is not a normal working practice. Secret dossiers lying around the flat and various people with access PIN numbers to get into that flat. The whole thing is just laughable. But unfortunately, that is the UK that we are currently part of. And this is the leader of that UK. It doesn't get any better.
Absolutely, Martin. The other thing that struck you, all of those points are absolutely well made. The other thing that struck me from the Prime Minister seeking to deflect attention and pointing at administrative reorganisations in Whitehall was that, as we know, the Prime Minister has a notoriously chaotic approach to anything that matters. A number of MPs made that point this afternoon. Is there anyone anywhere who believes that this Prime Minister could effectively organise a cheese and wine party in the garden, let alone establishing a new government department at the centre of Whitehall?
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody organised the proverbial, but I suspect he had a bit of help pulling it off. But he certainly likes his parties, judging by the sheer scale and number of them that have been identified. And of course, that is simply the ones that have came out into the public domain. Who knows what other ones might be there? Because perhaps one of the more worrying comments that is in the Sue Gray report was about the culture where staff were frightened to raise their concerns. So who knows how many other incidents could have came into the light had staff not been frightened to raise their concerns and done a bit of whistleblowing.
That's a very good point, and I suppose in the context that much of the whistleblowing we've seen since has apparently revolved around former employees, and in particular Mr. Cummings. That perhaps underlines the point that those who were working at the heart of government felt that there was nobody they could speak to and nobody that they could to whom they could draw attention as to what was going on. There was one more question I would ask about the nuts and bolts of inside the Downing Street and Whitehall bubble before we maybe start to look at the politics of all of this a little bit more. When I looked at the update from Sue Gray this afternoon, I noticed that with regard to other potential sacrificial lambs, in the general findings, number 7, I think, Sue Gray wrote, "Too much responsibility and expectation is placed on the senior official whose principal function is the direct support of the Prime Minister. This should be addressed as a matter of priority," she wrote. So do you think, is this suggesting that Downing Street is also planning to use the current Principal Private Secretary, Martyn Reynolds, as the fall guy, but at the same time the civil service is trying to defend Mr. Reynolds, and we're going to see more conflict between Downing Street and the Home Civil Service?
That's a very realistic possibility. It's a very strange scenario that we've had outlined, because the Sue Gray report obviously leads into all the chaos that's been around Downing Street and highlights a number of points where it comes in. And definitely there's probably been too much pressure placed on that one role. However, the Prime Minister's own statement today suggested that he's admitting that Downing Street's got too big and it's going to get pared back. So they seem to be pushing already in different directions, but then we always knew that the Prime Minister doesn't do detail.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martin. Well, as I say, we'll move away from the nuts and bolts and the detail around about the detail that the Prime Minister apparently struggles to grasp, and we'll talk a little bit more about the politics of this afternoon. Firstly, as you'd expect, the first questions came from the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, and it struck me that his performance was a kind of standard Keir Starmer performance today. One thing in particular stood out to me. He said that honesty and decency matters in public life. Now, given what we've been witnessing for several years, is he correct when he says that, or did that ship sail long ago, if indeed that ship ever existed?
I think to be fair, he is correct in saying that it does matter. Unfortunately, the current government has lost all sense of proportion, and it doesn't matter to them. It's not going to matter to Johnson and his friends. His own MPs must by now realise that if they didn't know what he was like when they put him into office, they certainly know what he's like now. And the question is, why are they keeping him there? His position is untenable. And, you were surprised when I say this, but I do feel genuinely sorry for some of the decent Tories, because, no party should be led by such a charlatan.
It certainly makes life decent for, as you say, the other Tories to... It must make getting up in the morning and looking at themselves in the mirror before they head into the House of Commons. It must make, or head into their surgeries on the weekends. It must make their lives very difficult. In the context of what Keir Starmer said, he also described the Prime Minister as a man without shame. Now, I don't begin to understand why voters find this Prime Minister a compelling politician who they will vote for, but I wondered if perhaps one explanation might be that in all of the talk that we have about voters baking in Johnson's behaviour, his personality, his unique approach to life, and his family, that is it perhaps that voters, in a sense, envy his ability to operate at the highest level in government without any shame at all?
I, I, I wish I knew what the rationale was, because clearly people that must normally be perfectly sane and rational have put him into office, and that makes no sense whatsoever. I'm left thinking of the old quip that the veteran Scottish nationalist Oliver Brown used to say about elections were for people who didn't take their politics too seriously. Well, I think Boris Johnson is probably the modern day equivalent of that. You know, it's the light entertainment approach rather than the serious approach. I have a friend in London who I haven't seen actually since before lockdown, who is a Tory member, and I remember bumping into him during the leadership contest, and he told me he'd voted for Boris, and I thought, this is bonkers. I said, why on earth did you do that? He must have been the worst possible choice that was there. And without a word of a lie, I won't name him to save his embarrassment, because I'm sure he will now be genuinely embarrassed. He said, oh, I thought he'd be a good laugh. Well, you know, maybe if you were at the Downing Street parties, he was a good laugh, but running the country through a pandemic and potentially running the country perhaps in a conflict with Russia over the Ukraine, that is a scary prospect, and one that nobody should be subject to. They've got to get rid of him, and they've got to get rid of him fast.
Well, that's a good point. I was struck by the contrast in performance again between Keir Starmer, who was pretty measured, pretty straight, pretty lawyerly in his delivery, and we won't be distracted by the John Smith lessons about not treating the House of Commons like the Court of Session and not treating the Court of Session like the House of Commons. But I was struck again by the contrast between Starmer, who was playing it pretty straight down the line, and Johnson, who, as you say, was cracking jokes, was deflecting as fast as he could go, and of course was sitting on the front Tory front bench laughing as a number of MPs pointed out reports of both themselves and their constituents' experience of losing loved ones during the lockdown restrictions at a time when there were persistent parties being held in Downing Street, apparently in breach of the COVID regulations. So do you think there's now that contrast, and the Tory politicians and Tory voters seem to warm to Johnson's comedic approach to life, in contrast to Keir Starmer's more serious approach. Do you think there's any prospect of that contrast coming to an end, of voters and others deciding that they've had the last laugh and that the comedy has to end?
I think it has to end, and I think the opinion polls are starting to point that direction. The Tories are going to get a bit of a bloody nose, I think, in May at the local elections. I mean, the clown act was fine when people thought it was an act, but once you know it's reality, and it's the curtain's been whipped back on the Wizard of Oz scene, and you see him for what he is, there's no way anybody with any credibility could keep him in position.
That's a very good point that you make, Martyn. We'll come back to this one again, but just because you've mentioned it, as you say, the prospect of the Oz-style curtain being drawn back and reality biting. As you say, there's the prospect of the local elections and the Stormont elections in May. Do you think after today, and without prejudging anything else that we learn, do you think after today the likelihood is that this Prime Minister will continue to hobble on until we get to the May elections?
I think he certainly wants to hobble on. He wants to put as much distance between what he's done and where he's going as he possibly can. And I suppose the question is, at what point does that become untenable for his own party members? I think for any sane member it probably already is. But if you were looking at it from a purely selfish point of view, you might say, well, why start the process of replacing the leader now just for whoever takes over to get a slap in the face with the first electoral contest? Perhaps if you were in their shoes, you might say, well, let him take the blame for that and we'll get rid of him for everything at the one time.
That's certainly been a theme in terms of letting the current Prime Minister take the blame perhaps for the COVID response that we saw from Westminster, and as you say, for what is predicted to be the likely political outcome at the May local elections and Stormont elections. One final question with regard to Keir Starmer's participation today. The Prime Minister's response to Starmer really was, to me, all that the Prime Minister did was to ghost Keir Starmer with Mrs Thatcher's mate, the disgraced Jimmy Savile, and also Jeremy Corbyn, who the Prime Minister curiously described as a Prime Minister who would have abolished NATO, which I'm sure Jeremy Corbyn has many abilities, but even as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, it would not be in his gift to abolish NATO. So in terms of that, the level that the Prime Minister is responding to these questions at, is that an indication to us that in addition to very few actual policies and very little policy delivery, the Prime Minister has no substantive answers to the findings in the update that was published today, let alone the winder charges that he misled the House of Commons?
Yeah, absolutely. His whole style has always been bluff and bluster, large arm gesticulations and head waves and just deriding his opponents. That is his entire style. There is no substantive substance to anything that he ever performs at.
And that's an interesting point, Martyn. You've been in the House since 2015. So you've seen more than one Prime Minister in action. What is the response across the House from all corners to the comedic or the clown-like or the chaotic or the knockabout style that Johnson has in comparison to previous Prime Ministers? What's your impression?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm a nationalist, not a Tory, so I come with a bias. But I mean, my looking at it, I always thought Cameron was a bit of a spiv, a bit of a con artist, smooth operator. I thought May was probably potentially more consensual, but she totally arsed everything up with the Brexit situation and couldn't control her own party. She now looks eminently more statesman-like in comparison to Boris. And I thought at the time she was the worst Prime Minister of my lifetime, but it was a title very rapidly claimed by the current occupant. And Boris has been the poorest of them, I think, probably in all time. I can't imagine. I'm a great fan of history. I can't actually think of anyone that's been less suited to the role.
I think a number of members of the House of Commons giving interviews to the press after the statement this afternoon have certainly reflected and repeated that point of view, that in their perspective, Johnson is without doubt the worst Prime Minister certainly in recent history, possibly longer than recent history. In terms of that trajectory for Westminster and for the institutions at Westminster, as you say, a number of people regarded Theresa May as the worst Prime Minister that they had encountered, and inevitably the current Prime Minister picked up that mantle and ran with it to prove that he could do better, worse. I'm not sure which. Given the prospect at the moment of a leadership challenge to Boris Johnson at some point from within the Tory party, either before or after the May elections, do you think that we're going to see it? And thinking about the cabinet that Johnson has surrounded himself with, do you think that there's a prospect that trajectory of successively worse prime ministers, one after the other, is that likely to continue? Are we going to get an even worse prime minister after this one?
I mean, in terms of setting a low bar, it would be pretty hard to beat Boris Johnson. But let's be perfectly honest, there is an extremely limited gene pool in the leading members of the Tory party at the moment. They certainly culled some of the more enlightened people before the last election. It's very much a Brexit cult that's there. I think in my lifetime we've witnessed the Tories move from being sort of the economic right in and they're going further to the right. Any leadership contest that comes, and I think be a very welcome wake-up message, because it doesn't get any better.
Thanks, Martyn. Your Wi-Fi is struggling a wee bit. I suspect it may be fellow parliamentarians who are logging on to do interviews with other TV channels at the same time is starting to drain the broadband away from you. But we will persist, if that's okay. It looks like we've got connection issues at Martyn's end. Let's see if his Wi-Fi stabilises, and we can continue. Martyn, can you hear me? It looks like we've got a couple of problems there with connections. As I say, Mr. Day has returned to his office in Westminster, and my suspicion is that the broadband there is being hammered by the number of politicians who will be giving online interviews. So I'm not surprised that we're seeing the signal and the connection breaking up. Let's just check one more time if Ian's been able to join us once more. Ian, can you hear me? Martyn, sorry, Martyn, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm sorry. We will persist and see if we can get Martyn Day reconnected to us, because then I was next going to talk to him about Ian. Oh, I think Martyn's come back to us. Martyn, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, the 4G
Brilliant.
seems to have dropped out for some reason, but I've managed to hotspot to my phone, which is
we're very grateful to you. Thank you. I suspect the wires and the air is red hot in Westminster this evening, so it's no surprise. But thank you for persisting. I was going to say that Ian Blackford gave a bravura performance this afternoon, culminating with him repeatedly making the point that the Prime Minister has misled the House. Now that then led to the inevitable to and fro with the Speaker about parliamentary language and Mr. Blackford leaving the chamber. I know I've noticed that the BBC, I think, is misreporting that Mr. Blackford was named by the Speaker, whereas I don't think he was.
He wasn't.
I think he had left the chamber before that happened. So, notwithstanding the BBC's traditional attention to detail and accurate reporting, now you and I understand the how and the why of the nuts and bolts of parliamentary language and what was going on there. But how does that aspect of parliamentary procedure and these important events, how do you think that plays with a voter in Linlithgow? Is it too arcane, too obtuse, or does it provide Ian Blackford with the opportunity to say out loud what everyone else is thinking, and then the Speaker helpfully repeats it?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, the public can see a lie for what it is. And at the same time, obviously, they do like debate to be respectful and considered, but respect has to be earned. And if someone's basically lied their face off both to Parliament and the public and treating everyone with contempt, then that should be called out. And Ian did a very good job in calling that out. And it was nice that the Speaker helped amplify that.
It's an interesting aspect. Do you think that there's prospect, perhaps, given that now we've had 20 years of the Scottish Parliament, where the procedures and proceedings might be regarded as being slightly more into the 20th century rather than the 18th century in the House of Commons? Do you think there's any prospect of, and particularly with this current Speaker of the House of Commons, do you think there is any prospect of modernising or bringing some of these proceedings and processes up to date, or are we going to continue to see people calling out the Prime Minister for misleading the House and lying, and apparently that not being appropriate?
Yeah, I think they're beyond change. I mean, we've in the 5-6 years we've been at, we're coming up for 7 years now that we've been at Westminster, we've all tried to bring changes forward, and they just haven't came. They're beyond reform. The best we can do is just get rid of Westminster altogether and have our own fully independent Parliament. and I apologise that there's now a division bell ringing in the background, just to add to the antiquated nature, almost right on cue, to illustrate how out of date the whole place is. And I'm just checking to see if this is one I have to run to, or if it isn't. I honestly don't know. I've not. I think I'm probably okay to stay for a bit.
It's okay, Martin. It's not a problem. We, as you say, it's a useful demonstration of the nature of Westminster and Westminster politics in action. Are you expected to respond to that division bell?
I am just checking. I don't think so. We'll find out if I appear in the press for having missed a key vote tomorrow morning. But I'm at the far end of the estate, so unless I hear something, I will hold fire.
Okay, we'll persist. That's no problem at all. One thing that struck me, but before he left the chamber this afternoon, Mr. Blackford also pointed out that the Prime Minister was laughing throughout the exchange between them, and that the families and loved ones of the 150,000 plus people who have died from COVID were not laughing. Now, inevitably, the cameras were not focused on the Prime Minister at that time. So, how do you get the message across to voters that the Prime Minister was laughing at that point in the proceedings? Or put it another way, do you think voters pick up and understand, as we mentioned before, the difference in approach between Starmer, who was pretty subdued, Ian Blackford, who was unsurprisingly expressing what might be described as righteous indignation, and Boris Johnson, who was laughing at them both?
Yeah, I think the voters do get that message because they can see the behaviour, and it's not an isolated incident. I mean, Boris repeatedly, and we saw it today in the chamber, sits there and does his sort of head shoulder roll, clearly as if it's it's no skin off my nose kind of attitude when people are pointing out his inadequacies, which is an interesting defence and coping mechanism, which if I was a Tory member, I'd be quite alarmed at seeing him doing. So, long may he continue to expose himself and his party for what they actually are.
I'm hearing, Martin, that the division is on the advanced research legislation, just in case it is something you think you need to run to.
Right, I'll just check just now.
Stephen Flynn's just been speaking.
It's my eyesight isn't good enough to see the wee TV in the screen. If that's Stephen sitting in the corner, if he's sitting there, I'm.
We'll persist with the programme just now.
Yes.
Okay, it's consideration of Lord's amendments of the Advanced Research and Innovation Bill. But we'll persist with this for the moment. A few other senior Tory MPs have indicated today that they no longer support the Prime Minister. Andrew Mitchell, for example. Do you think senior Tory MPs like Mitchell and the former Prime Minister Theresa May, do you think with them beginning to stand side by side, do you think will they be able to build up enough of a head of steam behind that to get this issue back on the boil properly, and to perhaps get as far as 54 letters being submitted to the 1922 subcommittee and perhaps a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister?
I have to say, and I've said this repeatedly since he became Prime Minister, I'm still gobsmacked that they appointed him in the first place. But many of them would have been waiting, as they were instructed to do, for the Sue Gray report. Now, they're now trying to pivot that onto let's wait for the full investigation to take place. But the Sue Gray report itself is a totally damning indictment that proves his position's untenable. Anyone with any conscience would be putting in their letter to start that process.
Absolutely, Martin. And actually thinking about the police for a moment, we'll come back to the question that Joe Cherry asked in a moment. But Hannah Bardell stood up and asked why the Metropolitan Police, in her words, were so late to the party. Now, from all that we've and one of the criticisms,
they were the bouncers. So, I mean, they know exactly what happened in Downing Street. There is absolutely no reason that they should have been dragging their feet on this one.
Precisely. From all that we've seen over the summer from the Metropolitan Police, and in particular from the Commissioner, Dame Cressida Dick, the Assistant Commissioner for Professionalism in the Metropolitan Police, who's Helen Ball, who's Dame Cressida Dick's wife, and of course the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Professionalism, who's Baz Javid, Sajid Javid's little brother. Is it a? Is, I'm sorry, I'm being. Well, I'm happy that the Assistant Commissioner for Professionalism in the Met Police is Helen Ball, and that the Deputy Assistant, who may not be Dame Cressida Dick's wife, and that the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Professionalism is Sajid Javid's little brother. Is it a surprise that the Met apparently were much happier battering women protesters over the summer and ignoring, as you say, what was happening right under their noses as they were the bouncers at the end of the street at Downing Street?
Well, I think they obviously have their own reputation to restore. Things certainly don't look good. I would not be suggesting that there's been any wrongdoing on their behalf regarding those matters, because I don't have any facts. But they need to restore public confidence, and that is severely lacking with the way this whole issue's been handled. But the fundamental point is they had officers on the ground during these events. They will know who was coming in and out of Downing Street. They will have known when law breaking was taking place. And part of policing is not just chasing people after somebody reports a crime; it's preventing it from happening when they see it under their own noses.
Thanks, Martyn. And thinking about that police angle, the police aspect to all of this today, one of the deflections I've heard a few times this week is that the worst that the Metropolitan Police could do would be to issue fixed penalty notices for breaching the COVID restrictions at the time. Now, when she asked her question to the Prime Minister, your colleague Jo Cherry, QCMP, applied her legal experience and asked about rather more serious criminality, for example, charges of misconduct in public office or conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Do you think that there's any prospect of those types of charges will begin to take hold in the minds of the public, or perhaps in the minds of the Metropolitan Police, as you say, they seek to restore their somewhat battered reputation?
Well, it's certainly possible, and when you kick over a stone, you never quite know what you're going to find underneath. I think the worry would be if these fixed penalty notices are applied, and then we never hear any more about who actually was fined, and we don't see the full version of the Gray report. Because that would then be, an absolute appalling situation where the police have been used to support a cover-up.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martyn. Now, moving away from maybe overly legalistic and police-orientated questions, one other thing that we've learned this afternoon is that apparently the call that was scheduled between the Russian Premier Vladimir Putin and the Prime Minister was cancelled because the Prime Minister was busy in the House of Commons repeating the line, wait for the conclusions of the police investigation, and otherwise spending hours and hours and hours of time attempting to defend what many would regard as the indefensible. So, thinking back to what we were saying earlier about the apparently chaotic organisation in Downing Street, does the inability of the Prime Minister to manage his diary in a way that means that he can talk to the Russian Premier, who, as we were saying, has parked his tanks very much on the Russian border with Ukraine, does that give us a clue just how chaotic things are in Downing Street?
I think things are quite chaotic, and given the seriousness of that event, I think that perhaps the worrying thing is that it shows that foreign powers can almost dismiss him as an irrelevance. He's becoming a lame duck Prime Minister, and he's not able to fulfil his role in office.
Well, that's a good point, Martyn. In terms of the current status of the standoff, if you will, or of the escalation of events between Russia and Ukraine, it strikes me that the UK government's announcement of supplying some anti-tank weapons and some training to the army of Ukraine, it strikes me not so much as saber rattling as being perhaps cocktail stick rattling or something even less. And when that's combined with what one would expect President Putin knows, which is that the Tory party is, at least in part, funded by Russian oligarchs who are close to Vladimir Putin. Where do you think that leaves the British response to the events that are unfolding in Ukraine and on the Russian border?
I think the whole situation is very, very worrying. I have to confess, I missed most of that statement because I was out of the chamber preparing for the health one that was coming up after that. But it's not a good position to see any country in, and we are tied into it. I just hope we don't find ourselves over the next few weeks having gone from the wait for the Sue Gray report, wait for the Metropolitan Police report, to let's wait till the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Things need dealt with now, or we could find ourselves in a far worse situation that nobody's in control of.
Thanks, Martin. Now, I'm going to sound like Columbo here a little bit for a moment, because there's one other question I was going to ask you about the police angle here, and that was, what odds do you think we can get, that you can get, or I can get, that the Metropolitan Police decide that it's not in the public interest to recommend a prosecution, and the whole thing runs into the sand with the perpetually greased piglet making good his piglet escape?
Well, I think I'm not convinced that the Met Police has particularly acted so far in the public interest. They've been very late to the game, despite the fact that they would have been the most informed operators in the pitch. So I would hope that they can do nothing other than pursue the law to its natural conclusion. And I think that is the only thing that now that is in the public interest, and anyone that looks at that would come to that now without prejudicing what they find out. There's definitely been parties. The Sue Gray report evidences that, gives us 16 of them over a range of dates, and it's a question of who is responsible for that law breaking. Ultimately, irrespective of who organised the parties, it's the culture from the top, and it's the Prime Minister that should be carrying the can rather than sacrificing more junior members of his government or his staff. Thanks,
Martin. And finally, today we've seen still we've seen no admission of the parties which were previously denied, but which, according to Sue Gray's update, did take place. And we've seen no firm commitment to publish anything further from Sue Gray. So we know that the Prime Minister is talking to Tory MPs, I think, at the moment. What do you think the mood is going to be in that meeting from what you've heard this afternoon, realising that this is still pretty early doors in terms of the events of today?
Well, obviously, as I said before, I don't think like a Tory, so I have a slight difficulty with why they've not acted already, but anyone that's defending them finds that the grounds that they're defending just get dafter and dafter, and they end up with less credibility. And generally, most people would try and protect their own reputation, and I think that's the stage that they're probably now at. The only thing they can do to salvage their own reputations is to get rid of him or to go down with a sinking ship.
Thank you, Martin. With that, we've used the ship metaphor a few times this evening, so rounding up with the ship sinking, it's probably time to say that that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. And we really need all the financial assistance that we can get in order to do more of what we do. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work, so if you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. But before then, firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to Martyn Day MP for joining us from Westminster and for giving us his time and his contributions this evening. Thanks, Martyn.
No problem, thank you.
Thank you to everybody for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland today. Please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.